So we're going to continue our exponent lesson with negative exponents. Okay, so if I have the exponent 2 to the third power, I know that that means 2 times 2 times 2. Okay, so my base is multiplied by itself 3 times, and this equals 8. Well, if my exponent is negative, what do we do? Well, I still have a base of 2, so I have to do something with the number 2. The negative exponent basically tells me to take the inverse of my number. And if you remember with fractions, an inverse is the same thing as the reciprocal. I think that's spelled right, not quite sure. Okay, so the inverse or the reciprocal of a number is flipping it over. So if I'm looking at 2, I make it into a fraction, 2 over 1. And the negative exponent says, take the reciprocal of this number. So it becomes 1/2 to the third power. Or I can write it as 1/2 to the third power like that. So your negative exponent says, take the reciprocal. And that would just be simply 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. The exponent says take the base and multiply it by itself 3 times. 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/8. So there is the relationship between 2 to the positive third power and 2 to the negative third power. The answers are reciprocals of each other. So what happens if I start out with a fraction raised to the negative power? Well, again, the negative exponent says take the reciprocal or take the inverse of your base. So the inverse of 1/5 is 5 over 1, and now that's to the second power. Or I can simply write that as a whole number, 5 squared. So 1/5 to the negative 2 is the same thing as 5 squared, because my negative exponent says take the reciprocal or take the inverse of the base. And the inverse of the fraction, we just flip it upside down. And that's how you deal with negative exponents. The negative exponent says you take the reciprocal or you take the inverse of the base. And that's the whole trick with negative exponents.